In this, its characteristic work, absolute freedom becomes explicitly objective to itself, and self-consciousness learns what absolute freedom in effect is. In itself, it is just this abstract self-consciousness which effaces all distinction and all continuance of distinction within it. It is as such that it is objective to itself. The terror of death is the vision of this negative nature of itself. But absolutely free self-consciousness finds this its reality quite different from what its own notion of itself was. That is, that the universal will is merely the positive essence of personality, and that this latter knows itself in it only positively or as preserved therein. Here, however, this self-consciousness, which as pure insight completely separates its positive and its negative nature, completely separates the predicateless absolute as pure thought and as pure matter, is confronted with the absolute transition of the one into the other as a present reality. The universal will, qua absolutely positive, actual self-consciousness, because it is this self-conscious reality heightened to the level of pure thought or of abstract matter, changes round into its negative nature and shows itself to be equally that which puts on an end to the thinking of oneself or to self-consciousness. In paragraph 592, we're seeing one key set of movements in the Aufhebung, the sublation is how we translate it in English, that's occurring in this passage. And we need to remind ourselves that for Hegel, at each point that there is a transition to a new shape of consciousness, like the one that we're going to be transitioning to in just a few paragraphs from now, there is always a negative moment of, you could say, critique or surpassing or opposing and conquering, but there's always a reincorporation of that. You never come back to exactly the same starting point that you originally began with and then left. There's always some transition and gain in the process. Here in this passage, Hegel's talking in very abstract terms, so we need to help ourselves out and think about what the reference of these are in terms of the historical moment that he sees as so central. This, transition that's taking place through the French Revolution to something like absolute freedom, and then the working out for itself in practice what absolute freedom really is. He begins this paragraph in a way that you might find a little bit enigmatic if you dwell on it, because it's very easy just to pass over this first sentence. In this, its characteristic work, absolute freedom becomes explicitly objective to itself. Self-consciousness learns what absolute freedom in effect is. And if you're just focusing on the second and third part of that passage, right, absolute freedom is is becoming explicitly objective to itself. We'll talk about the translation of that in just a moment. And self-consciousness learns what absolute freedom in effect is. You'll pass over this reference to a work. The German term for that is simply Werke, right? And this is something that has been accomplished, something that has been produced. And you could say, well, what is that? Right? And if we're looking back at the previous paragraph, what is it? Is it death? Is it this cold matter-of-fact annihilation of the existent self? A very particular, but also in some respects, quality-less kind of death? Is it the being suspected? Is it this interplay of government and faction and rising up against it? Sort of a delegitimization of the very thing that was supposed to solve this problem of legitimacy, the transition from the general or universal will into particular will. What is this work that Hegel is referring to? And I think here we actually need to think of all of these combined into one dynamic. This work, this thing that has been accomplished, is both what the government itself does, and its opposition in other individuals, other factions, and then this spread of universal suspicion, which then leads to killing. That's part of it, right? But because Hegel is saying that both absolute freedom and self-consciousness are acquiring something in the process, we also have to look at this as the work, the accomplishment of world spirit taking place through this revolution and then the terror that follows after that. I'd also like to dwell on something too. So this is important to keep in mind. Hegel had brought up suspicion in the previous paragraph. And now he's going to talk about learning something through negativity. Now, he's been focusing on a death that the government imposes or factions impose upon each other and all sorts of victims in the process. And it's a death that is particularly terroristic in that it reduces individuals in their meaning down to mere nothings, heads of cabbage to be cut off. We might think about some of the terrible atrocities that took place on the part of totalitarian governments. We can also think of the sort of terror that took place where there was, in effect, a kind of reigning anarchy that was allowing a space for violent, often racistly motivated groups to try to enforce their power. You could think, for example, of the terror involved here in the United States through lynching and the fact that legal enforcement of the sort of universal realm of law against that failed over and over and over again to the extent where entire communities could be wiped out. Particularly if they stood too high. So this is not something just about totalitarian governments. This is something that happens over and over again. Now, terror works by not killing everybody. If you kill everybody, then from a dialectical standpoint, you go back to start. You have to find new individuals who then you can inculcate in whatever way you want. It's sort of like the master-slave dialectic or the struggle to the death. If the two consciousnesses meet and the one kills the other, well, go back to start. However, in the master-slave dialectic, one consciousness imposes a sort of regime on the other, and it does so through fear, right? That's exactly what Hegel says in that point of the phenomenology. And we've encountered this at several other places. Now, this absolute suspicion is a suspicion of the other that they are going to abuse their power, that they are, guilty of something, and therefore you can use force against them. But it's also a suspicion that they will use that power on you. And so there's this dynamic of suspecting and being suspected. Insofar as you can be suspected by somebody else during the terror, you are, in some respects, as good as dead, except you're stuck there in that half-life, feeling the fear that perhaps your life might be snuffed out like that at any moment, as soon as the guards come for you and take you to the guillotine. On the other hand, you, as a human agent, are also inducing that suspicion in others. So we have a very complex dynamic here. All of this is wrapped up in this term work, right? So let's come back now to the sentence. In this, absolute freedom, and absolute freedom is, in essence, the government in this case, right? It starts out as like, liberty, fraternity, equality for all men. Of course, not for women, as Mary Wollstonecraft had to point out in her, vindication of the rights of women, addressed to the education, I believe, secretary, who was attempting to impose this absolute freedom across the board in terms of education for men, but leaving women out. Be that as it may, let's say it was totally across the board absolute freedom. Absolute freedom degenerates into, or rather develops into, the universal will taking the shape of a particular will. In doing so, Hegel says, it becomes, the translation here is it becomes explicitly objective to itself. And, the German is actually that it just becomes object to itself. It makes itself into an object. Something not just that can be manipulated like an object, but can be understood by itself in an objective fashion. And it does so through this work. And this work is something, I should have put this here, it is something that it imposes on self-consciousness, right? Self-consciousness, for its own part, whether it's the self-consciousness of those who are in a privileged position of governance, or the self-consciousness of the person who becomes the victim, or the self-consciousness of the person who's observing this, or the self-consciousness of the person who works as a tool in the machine. All these are different possibilities. Learns, the translation says, learns what it is that absolute freedom is going to be. And it learns that it's tyrannical in some respect, right? Now, learn here is a translation of erfahrt, right? And Erfahrung, erfahren. This comes from the sort of core of this is fahren, which has to do with like taking a journey. This is not something that it's learning from a book. It's learning by experiencing it and then reflecting upon that experience and perhaps engaging in discourse about it. So that's all for the first sentence. Let's go on with the rest, right? He says, in itself, absolute freedom is just this abstract self-consciousness which effaces all distinction and all continuance of distinction within it. And one way to efface that is precisely by imposing death or inducing this realm of suspicion. Hegel goes on and he says, it is as such that it is objective to itself. And here he clearly connects it with death. He says the terror of death is the vision of this negative nature of itself. Everybody within the society has to endure this terror of death, and not just a death that is a happy death at home with your family, gathered around, whispering some last words of wisdom to them. No, it's a death of being taken out to the field and shot in the back of the head, or brought in front of the guillotine and having everybody say terrible things about you before the blade comes down, and then you just having your body tossed into the Seine, or wherever else the things are taking place. So he goes on and he says, absolutely free self-consciousness finds this its reality quite different from what its own notion of itself was. Who's absolutely free self-consciousness? Well, everybody within the society. I mean, those slogans, freedom, liberté, right? Equality, fraternity, we might even, fraternity and sorority, right? Expand it a little bit further like I mentioned. Those seem to promise a new world. And that's what the Enlightenment was aiming at. A transformation of human society so it would become, for the first time ever, truly rational, truly just, truly free. And it turns out that absolute freedom isn't so easy to grasp. Now, there are two different ways one could go here. One could say, see, the revolution, terrible idea. We need hierarchy. We need this differentiation into classes. We need tradition. We need customs. Don't trust abstract rationality by itself. Edmund Burke is a great example of that, right? And then the traditionalists, the early traditionalists. I understand that traditionalists means something different for many people in the present, but the traditionalists before the contemporary traditionalists were saying that the French Revolution was a huge mistake. And we need to go back to something prior to that. That's one option. Dialectically, that is not going to work. Instead, we move forward. We move through it. We see what's on the other side of this. So he goes on and he says, what was the notion of itself? That the universal will is merely the positive essence of personality. This latter knows itself in it only positively or as preserved therein. But what we find instead of this, he says, is self-consciousness, which is pure insight, separates its positive and negative nature. Separates the predicateless absolute. What's he referring to? The predicateless absolute is the divine of the Enlightenment, right? Into thought and matter. Positive and negative. So he says we have pure thought and pure matter. So here he tells us it's confronted with the absolute transition of the one into the other as a present reality. This is where it's very metaphysical, and you might say, what is he talking about? So pure thought is the positive here. Think about what we mean when we're talking about pure thought. Think about the previous terms that we applied that to. Faith, which had a content. We're not talking about that here. And then enlightenment was another form of pure thought. So pure thought, the ideology of the Enlightenment, is what self-consciousness finds at its very essence as absolute freedom. Pure thought, there's a transition from that to pure matter. What is pure matter? Is it simply atoms, quarks? We have our physical explanations of these. There's an earlier conception of matter that I think Hegel has in mind here. And when we talk about pure matter, we might have in mind something like the prime matter that the Aristotelians and then later Thomist tradition talked about. And this is matter without any properties. I mean, it's sort of like, when Locke in his own turn talks about a pure substratum, the substance. And it doesn't, it just is what it is. And of course, the qualities come out of configurations that it just happens to have. There's an unintelligibility there. And there's a similar unintelligibility within the social frame of the kind of death that Hegel has been raising before our eyes as something to be terrorized by. So he goes on and he says, the universal will, qua absolutely positive, actual self-consciousness, because it is this conscious reality heightened to the level of pure thought, or, as he says, abstract matter. What is abstract matter? It's matter understood in an abstract way, that is, through thought. In a way, it's not really matter. It's not the matter as it is in itself. So he goes on and he says, this changes round into its negative nature and shows it to be equally that which puts an end to the thinking of oneself or to self-consciousness. What is it that puts an end to the thinking of itself or self-consciousness here? It's death. So when he's talking in these essentially allegorical terms about pure thought and pure matter, we have a transition from this dynamic where there is consciousness to death. And this is very difficult for consciousness to actually wrap its head around. Absolute freedom as pure self-identity of the universal will thus has within it negation, but this means that it contains difference in general, and this again it develops as an actual difference. For pure negativity has in the self-identical universal will the element of subsistence or the substance in which its moments are realized. It has the matter which it can utilize in accordance with its own determinateness, and insofar as this substance has shown itself to be the negative element for the individual consciousness, the organization of spiritual masses or spheres to which the plurality of individual consciousnesses are assigned thus takes shape once more. These individuals who have felt the fear of death of their absolute master again submit to negation and distinctions, arrange themselves in the various spheres, and return to an apportioned and limited task, but thereby to their substantial reality. Paragraph 593 now describes for us a dynamic that should be quite familiar to us as readers of the Phenomenology, because we've seen it come up over and over and over again, a sort of hyper-unity giving way to a differentiation within itself, and the conscious person finding him or herself now within no longer the unity, but within the plurality, an organized, to some degree, plurality, which may be in some transition or conflict, But is that going to be the end of the story? Why is Hegel introducing this here? You notice in the paragraph coming after this, a very long paragraph, there's going to be a major contrast drawn between what seems to be happening here and what has happened over and over again in the progress of consciousness and where we're actually going. So let's chart out what is happening. He says, absolute freedom as pure self-identity of the universal will, right? We've got this universal will. Absolute freedom is this pure self-identity. Who's getting to enjoy the pure self-identity? Whoever happens to have power at the time, or perhaps it's even death itself and this dynamic of terror. But he says it has within itself negation. It has within itself negation. And Hegel goes on to say, okay, that means that it contains difference, because you can't simply negate within a Parmenidean sphere in which all is being, nothing is non-being, right? Even that betrays itself in the fact that it's relying upon a grammar and differentiation within that. So Hegel says we do have negativity leading to difference, but he calls this difference in general. And the term here is actually Unterschied, which we can translate as difference, but you might also think in terms of differentiation. You know, a sheed is taking place, a splitting, a cut, a distinguishing of two things from each other. Or, in this case, many things, a multiplicity, a plurality, as he's going to say, from each other. This difference in general becomes actual difference, Wirklichen, right? Wirklichen Unterschied. It's no longer just a difference in name, a difference in concept, a difference that we could, think about and purely intellectually. It's an actual difference in the world that we live in. And, this makes perfect sense. Whatever absolute freedom is going to be, it's going to need a society which is going to have different parts to it with different functions, and they're going to have to be coordinated in some way. So he goes on and he says, this means it contains, an actual difference. Then he says, pure negativity, and here it gets, again, very metaphysical, has in it the self-identical universal will, the element of subsistence, or the substance in which its moments are realized. And now think back to just a few paragraphs before, where we did have all of these different parts, or as he's going to call them, spiritual masses and spheres, and they all got subsumed into the society run by the government, representing the universal will. Now that's being restored. Once the revolutionary changes have been made, you still need somebody to issue driver's licenses. You still need to make sure that the crops in the field actually get to the marketplace. We could go on and on and on with examples. So he says, this it has the matter which it can utilize in accordance with its own determinants. It's using these spiritual masses and spheres. And these are not just spiritual, geistige, mental. These are material, too. The farmer taking things to market is actually driving his tractor, which needs gas, which, uses tires that have to be replaced every so often. There are all these wirkliche, actual, real considerations to bring up. So he goes on and he says, insofar, here's the key payoff, insofar as this substance has shown itself to be the negative element for the individual consciousness. So let's dwell on that. This substance, right? It's shown itself to be the negative element for the individual consciousness. It is self-consciousness, but it's a particular self-consciousness, and it's opposed to the other self-consciousnesses, which find themselves, in a certain sense, alienated from that absolute freedom that they get to see being exercised. Where do they get to go? They are now forced all back into these spiritual masses and spheres once again. So in a certain respect, they're no longer enjoying the status of being, each of them, a sort of representative of the universal will. They get to represent the universal will by giving in to the actual individual will of whoever's running the show, who speaks for the universal will and tells them where they need to be, what they need to do. He goes on and he says, the organization of spiritual masses or spheres to which the plurality of individual consciousnesses are assigned thus takes shape once more. Notice, assigned. Who assigns them? To some degree, they could assign themselves, you might say. Somebody might say, I want to be in the army. I want to cook. I want to stay here on the farm and make food now for the revolutionary government or something like that. But in a large respect, what is it that we see revolutionary governments doing? They reorganize society. No. Don't stay on the farm. We need you in the factory over here. And, we see collectivization. We see, people, to use Rousseau's formulation, being forced to be free. Be free in the way that the universal will decides that they will be free, which may lead to their own destruction. And not just destruction, but effacement, being taken out of the story altogether. He goes on and he says, these individuals, now notice this key phrase, these individuals who felt the fear of death of their absolute master. Take that and put that in your back pocket for right now. But that's going to be very important. They again submit to negation and distinctions, arrange themselves into the various spheres, and return to an apportioned and limited task, but thereby to their substantial reality. Substantial reality is part of the fabric of society, right? The society that's been gone itself through the terror, and these individuals have gone through the terror as well, and may still be going through it. Insofar as they do return to their apportioned tasks and spheres and spiritual masses, they can forget that terror for a while, can't they? I'm so glad that all this, bloodshed is over. Now I can get back to my farm. Now I can get back to my bookkeeping. Now I can go work in that building. Meet the new boss, same as the old boss, except he's wearing a revolutionary hat. Which is great, because I already know how the procedures work, so I can now make them work for this new governance. The question that lies before us is, does this represent a return to business as usual, or has something been gained in the process?